Good evening. Good evening. Well,
That's what I understand.
welcome to our the second of our lecture series for 1995. Tonight we are going to be having Streetsville presentations by Susan Redmayne. I'm going to just say a few words because there are a few people coming in about what's upcoming in this week. Next week is Heritage Week, and we have a number of activities planned in case you haven't heard about them or read them in the paper. There will be a Curator's Challenge next Friday. We do have a flyer out there on. We'll be very fortunate to have with us next Friday, a week this Friday, I should say, 4 curators, or 1 appraiser and 3 curators who will be appraising, identifying, and talking about conservation and storage advice on various articles that people have. There is no charge, so we are asking if people want to give a donation, that's fine. But that will be held in the Great Hall out here between 11:30 and 2 p.m. on Friday, February 24th. In addition, we are promoting restaurants that are in heritage buildings through an event called Savor the Flavor. And there are these bookmarks out on the table if you wish to help yourself to them, of 8 restaurants that are located in historical buildings here in Mississauga. And most of them are having special heritage menus for the next 2 weeks. So please help yourself to that. We also have a book launch of Redmayne's week's book, Port Credit at Glimpse of Other Days. She will be doing the signing of these books on Wednesday from 4 to 6, also in the Great Hall. There are a number of other things, but I'll let you read about them. Our newsletter is out there, as well as the 2 new walking tours, Port Credit and Streetsville, which Susan is going to talk to us about tonight. Susan was with us during the summer. She's our historical research student, and she is in her 2nd year of law at U of T. Susan has had an interesting background in that she has done many things. She has worked with the Downtown Legal Services. She's also worked on the Faculty of Law Review. She has been on the Central Ontario Regional Parliament, which is a youth parliament that deals with a mock parliament of how the actual government system works, and she was appointed opposition House Leader in 1992. Susan, during her time with us during the summer, spent a lot of time up at the Hill Archives, researching Streetsville, and also at the Central Library, for which we are very grateful for the resources that are available through those sources. Tonight, she will be using the resources also of the Streetsville Historical Society, and John and Sam Emerson, who are in the audience, have assisted her in terms of this part of the slide presentation. So please help me welcome Susan Redmayne.
Thank you very much. My name is Susan Redmayne. I had this wonderful introduction all prepared, and now I don't feel like any of it's appropriate whatsoever. I'm embarrassed. I'm really, really pleased with the turnout tonight. This is great. I was kind of expecting there would be 5 or 6 people coming to hear me talk, and it would all be people who knew more about Streetsville than I did. So it's great to see some familiar faces and some not so familiar faces. As Kate Pepin was telling you just a moment ago, I was hired last summer as a historical researcher for Heritage Mississauga. And there were 2 projects going on last summer. One was to research Port Credit, and the other was Streetsville. And my cohort in crime, Ian Deans, who couldn't be here tonight, snapped up Port Credit. And I took Streetsville, and it worked out really well. Considering that I'd never actually even been to Streetsville before last summer, had kind of a vague idea where it was. It was kind of up Mississauga Road further than I had ever driven. I always kind of went up to Burnthorpe and made that right down towards Square One. So it's very interesting to start to learn a little bit more about Streetsville. To me, as a young person, Mississauga was a place that was about 20 years old. And I thought 3 months was going to be tons of time to research one of Mississauga's villages. And I was wrong. I ended up researching a whole village that has a greater than a 175-year history. And it created some very unique challenges. And I identified 3 challenges that I thought I'd mention before we get going tonight. The first was to put together a walking tour that people could do in a couple of hours when Streetsville boasts just a ton of interesting sites. And it came down to a problem how to choose between so many sites, all of which were worthy of being on the Heritage Tour. So it boasts actually the highest concentration of historical buildings in Mississauga. So there was that challenge. There was also the challenge that it's a village that has already been very well researched. They have a very active historical society, as Gay was mentioning in the introduction. The Streetsville Historical Society has been invaluable in collecting and preserving and writing about Streetsville and getting people to become more aware of the village. So there are a ton of resources already out there for a researcher like myself to start with, and that was a challenge in itself because unlike my friend Ian, who's researching Port Credit, he actually had a deficit of resources and had trouble finding enough things to cover some of the buildings he wanted to research, whereas I ended up with easily over a year's worth of research that I had to condense into a 3-month period of time. So there was that challenge as well. My third challenge, and it's a little bit more personal to me, is that my background is not in history in any way. I've never studied history except your standard introduction to Canadian history that we all have to take in grade 9 in high school. I've always been interested in history, interested specifically in my family's history. But my background is in English and in law, so although not history, they are 2 disciplines that lend themselves well to historical inquiry, I thought. So when I saw this job posted at the Summer Student Center last summer, and they said very specifically they were looking for somebody who was, background in history or related, I thought, well, I'll never get this job. But I was unemployed, so I thought I'd send my resume anyways. And I wrote this wonderful cover letter trying to say how law was like history. and lo and behold, I got the magic phone call, and I was really pleased. And I learned a lot about history and how to research history over the course of last summer. But if you believe that one's background informs one's view of history, then you should perhaps listen to my presentation with the caveat that my interests are maybe a little different than a true historian. I don't consider myself to have a strong interest in the architectural side of history, although many of the buildings in Streetsville are certainly significant for architectural reasons, and I've done my best in the pamphlet, which I hope you've all picked up outside, to highlight some of the more significant architectural features of some of these buildings, but it is not my strong point, and my ability to address questions on architectural information is somewhat lacking, so you can ask, and I can tell you that I don't know. I also didn't grow up in Streetsville, and a lot of the people who have written about Streetsville before me have had the pleasure of growing up and watching the village as it grew and changed over the years. So I maybe have some problems with the contextual aspect of some of these buildings because I drove down the street and became familiar with the streetscape for the very first time, halfway through June. So I apologize for any mistakes that I make, and I certainly welcome any corrections or opinions or reflections of anybody who's spent longer in the village than I have. I consider my special area of interest to be stories about people, which of course comes from my background in English. I have a love for fiction and a love for folklore, so I was especially interested in some of the stories I came across with some of the very, very colorful and interesting people that live in Streetsville. So I think you'll probably find when we get into it here that you're going to learn a lot about the families that live in Streetsville. Hopefully you'll learn something about the families. And maybe not so much the architectural stuff, but hopefully no one's going to be too disappointed in that. So at the end of 3 months of research, I'd become adept at reading abstract indexes of land deeds and maps, microfilms of early census reports, early commercial directories of the village, and all sorts of a variety of sources, just an incredible number of sources, and we can address that later on if people have questions. And what we ended up with was a Heritage Walking Tour pamphlet, which identified 33 points of interest within the village and within the area surrounding the village, some of which are not technically within the Streetsville core, but certainly within walking or driving distance. So I encourage everybody who hasn't done so to get out, and if you break up the tour and do it in a couple of afternoons or whatever, it hopefully turned out well. I was pleased with what I saw. February I don't think is the best month to launch a walking tour. For obvious reasons, it's too cold, and given the freezing rain we got yesterday, it's far too slippery for anybody to get out there and walk around. So what we've done tonight is put together a slideshow. So it's sort of an armchair heritage walking tour of Streetsville. And I hope to reiterate some of the information that's in the pamphlet, to add some new information, because there's no way you could fit everything there is to know about Streetsville in this pamphlet, and I think some of the more interesting stories that didn't necessarily fit in well, I've tried to remember and address tonight, so hopefully there's a little bit of extra information. I'm willing to discuss with people afterwards or during to explain why certain buildings were chosen for the tour and why maybe some of the other buildings weren't. And also, of course, where all this information came from. I tried to be as meticulous as I possibly could in doing my research, and I tried to keep track of all the sources I used. So feel free to question me about the sources that I've used, and if anyone's interested in conducting their own research project, there's certainly lots of information up here and in my portfolio, and I can help direct people on their own research projects. And before we begin our slide presentation for the evening, I'd like to thank the Streetsville Historical Society once again, and especially Mr. and Mrs. Emerson, who are sitting up there in the back, for opening their libraries and archives to make this slideshow possible. So, I'll just put the lights down, hopefully. So can everybody see that? So this is a slide of a mill complex in Streetsville. The village was named after a man named Timothy Street, and he was one of the first settlers in the area. Previous to arriving in this area along the Credit River, the Street family lived in St. David's near Niagara Falls, Ontario. The Street family is actually traced back to Puritan roots in England, and they came across from England, as did a number of Puritans. Timothy Street was born in 1777 in Columbia County, New York, and he came to Canada in 1800 at the age of 23. He stayed with his family friend, David Secord, which is a name that should ring a bell with some people who have a historical interest. This is the brother-in-law of heroine Laura Secord. He got himself settled in St. David's and then returned to New York to marry his fiancée, Abigail Smith, whom he brought back to St. David's with him. Timothy Street was kind of a jack of all trades. He worked as a tanner and as a newspaper man, and he engaged in a lot of land speculation to attempt to make his fortune. He and his partner, Richard Bristol, were given the contract to survey land that had been purchased from the Mississauga First Nations people. And these First Nations people were eventually relocated to the Mississaugas of the New Credit Reservation, which is near Hagersville, Ontario, and I had the pleasure of visiting this site over the summer and meeting some of the original Mississauga inhabitants. And Timothy Street, when he was conducting this survey of land that was north of what was called then the baseline, which is now Eglinton Road, and west of Huron, Ontario, which was their center line, he must have liked what he saw, which would have been rolling terrain and vast hardwood forests, The Credit River, seen here, which would have been teeming with Atlantic salmon at those times, and of course there are no Atlantic salmon left in the Credit River. The mill dams and the tremendous amounts of sawdust that would have come about as the area developed eventually would destroy the stocks of Atlantic salmon that were natural to the Credit River, and salmon that exist there now, I believe, are all the product of restocking efforts that have gone on in the Credit River. So he decided, after surveying the land, that he would like to settle here. And he applied for a mill site in Cunningham Township, but he was turned down. So he came and settled here in Streetsville. Of course, it wasn't known as Streetsville back then. So actually, as a matter of fact, it was kind of his second choice. But he constructed a mill dam, which you can't see in this photo. And he found 2 large stones on a neighboring farm, which he dragged with heavy oxen to his little valley here along the Credit River. And they were ground into shape, and there are journals written by people who witnessed the grinding of these millstones. And it is said that when these millstones were being ground into shape, when they released the water to turn these stones, that the whole valley filled with sparks as these stones were ground into shape. And the grist mill, which Timothy Street built at this site on the Credit, was said to be the first such mill on the Credit. So of course it was a tremendous boon to the settlers, because now people who farmed in the area didn't have to worry about transporting their grains many miles across very rugged terrain to have their grain ground. So this was actually an attractive feature and brought people to the area. He probably built his mill dam about 1821, around there. He had actually testified at a commission studying mills along the Credit in about 1826, and he said at that time that he had built his dam about 5 years previous to that. But in 1825, on the site, there was a sawmill, his grist mill, of course, which was the first. There was a carding machine, a tannery, and a distillery. So you can see up here, these are the various buildings that formed part of Timothy Street's mill complex. All of the land that Timothy Street owned in this area was given to him in exchange for the work that he did on the survey. His wife and family didn't move here right away. They remained in St. David's, where they maintained a residence, until 1825, when Timothy Street erected his first permanent family home in the area. Up until this time, his wife Abigail and any number of their 9 children that they had by 1825 traveled back and forth, and there's information to suggest that they summered in Streetsville in a small frame house that is no longer standing. But in 1825, and you can just get a glimpse of it up here, Timothy Street built a brick house. So we have another view of that house here. This is Timothy Street House in Streetsville, and as you can see, it's still standing. It's the only one of Street's complex of buildings that is still standing in Streetsville. It is also bearing the designation of being the first brick home in Peel County. It is made out of local red brick, although there's some debate about this. Some people seem to believe that he may have brought brick from across the lake in New York. But I have a pretty strong authority, pretty well-researched woman, who's indicated to me that that would be absolutely ridiculous, given that Streetsville is built on a wonderfully rich bed of natural red clay. So it would make sense that the bricks used in this first brick house were made of local red clay. As I mentioned, in 1825, when the house was built, Street had 9 children. And you kind of look at this house, which is said, you know, a couple rooms on the ground floor, 2 bedrooms upstairs, and you think, 9 children. It seems kind of small, but again, you have to remember that in 1825, and this was one of the mistakes I made, I always pictured settlers as being kind of these young men, you know, just setting out with a young wife and a baby in arms, whatever. But in in 1825, Streetsville Street, Timothy Street, was already about 48 years old. So, you know, he was well into his middle age, and most of his children were old enough to start living on their own. So, I suppose the house would be plenty big for that. In 1839, Timothy Street drew up a will, and this will is available to be viewed by the public in the Streetsville Public Library, hanging on the wall in there. And Timothy Street's signature is on the bottom of this will, and you can see that his handwriting's become very shaky in 1839. And it's perhaps no surprise that in 1840, the court declared Timothy Street to be a lunatic. His wife was made guardian, and his sons would have taken over the operating of the family businesses. It seems probably likely that Timothy Street maybe had a stroke or some other debilitating illness suddenly or whatever. So he remained alive for 8 years after being declared a lunatic. He died in 1848, but predeceased by 5 of his children, which is a lot. There's been a suggestion that maybe the Street family were victims of the cholera epidemic that wiped out a number of Canadian settlers throughout the 1830s, but no one knows for sure. There could have been a genetic weakness in the family, why so many of the children had passed away at relatively young ages. So we'll go on another slide of the Street house. Yeah, this is good. You can see these sumac trees, which are in the front of the house, and actually in the summertime, you kind of have to, without stepping onto the property, of course, which I didn't want to do when I was walking around for the first time, they almost impede the view of the front of the house. But I'm told that these sumac trees outline the mill race that used to run in front of the house to power the mills. So I found that to be a very interesting fact. I didn't actually know this until the weekend. I was actually up there rooting around in bushes over the summer trying to figure out where this old mill race would have been, and there it was in front of me the whole time. So you can get an idea of the house here. It's oriented a little bit strangely on the property. It's not facing the street like our modern homes do. It was built to face the mills. So it's actually, its side is what faces Mill Street there in Streetsville. So. After Timothy Street's death, the business was divided amongst the sons, as is evident from the will and from later census reports, of course. And then the mills, after leaving the Street family, passed through a series of many owners. And there's a tribute to Timothy Street and his selection of a mill site, when you think that a mill remained in operation on the site until well into the 20th century. In fact, there are photographs up until about 1950 showing mill buildings still on the site. So it's a pretty long history of milling right there. This little house is the second house on our armchair tour this evening, and it's known as Abigail Street House. Now, Abigail Street, Timothy's wife, was 65 when Timothy passed away. And she moved up Mill Street from her brick house, the family home, to this smaller home, which was the residence of her daughter Leonora Samantha and her husband, George Doherty, who was a miller, and he probably worked at one of Street's mills. Abigail died in 1859, and what's a little odd is that there is no grave marker in the local cemetery to mark her grave, although she would more than likely be buried somewhere near her husband, and there is a grave marker for Timothy Street. It's more than likely that the family wasn't terribly prosperous at the time of her death, and had maybe had plans at a later date to erect a marker for her and never got around to it for whatever reason. There's also the interesting fact that the Streets were Anglicans, although the 1851 census after Timothy Street had passed away shows that Abigail switched to the Wesleyan Methodist religion. So she kind of waited for her husband to die. I don't know. Abigail lived long enough to see her son John Street elected to be the first reeve of Streetsville in 1858. which is a nice testimony that a street would be the first breed, given that the village Streetsville is obviously named after the family. Shortly after his mother's death, John Street left the area and moved to London, Ontario, where he worked in the Indian Affairs Office. One of their other sons, Timothy Street, died in a very tragic fire in 1876, which destroyed two of Streetsville's prominent hotels. So that's Abigail's life there. This is an archival view of Cuthbert House. And I always thought Cuthbert House was a bit of a misnomer for this building because it was named for Richard Cuthbert, who never actually lived here. It's true that Richard Cuthbert ran a shoemaking business out of this building, but his actual residence was across the Credit River, and we'll get a little closer to that location a little later on. So you'd think that this building would be called Cuthbert's Store or something, but no, it's Cuthbert House, so we just kind of take that with a grain of salt. This is land, of course, that originally belonged to Timothy Street. He owned most of this land on which the next few houses are built. The original owner of the land was a blacksmith named Josiah Bennett, who bought a rather large chunk of land in 1830 for 50 pounds. So you can tell that land prices in the Streetsville area have escalated over the past couple hundred years. Josiah Bennett would have sold his land to gunsmith Richard Harris only 2 years later, but for 250 pounds, which indicated to me there was a pretty large rise in price there. Indicated to me that the building was probably constructed between 1830 and 1832, although there's probably some disagreement out there about the actual ages of these buildings. But gunsmith Richard Harris didn't hang on to the property for very long because there's another deed registered in 1832 to a George and John Ballinger, who were local innkeepers. And there is a pretty strong indication that the Ballinger brothers operated an inn in this building. I always thought it kind of had an inn look about it. I don't know whether you agree with me or not. In 1844, the property came to Richard Cuthbert, who was an Irish Catholic yeoman, according to the 1851 census. And it must have been a pretty prosperous shoemaking business because that same census lists 3 employees working for Richard Cuthbert for a shoemaking business. I would think that that would be a fair number of employees. So that's one view of Cuthbert House, and I think they have a more modern view. Yeah, this is what the building looks like today. And it's really quite striking when you're walking along the sidewalk, which is just down here along the front. It's very close to the sidewalk. There's very little frontage here, and you actually have to kind of step back to the other side of the street to understand the true magnitude of this building. It's quite magnificent. So, very, very interesting building there. Okay, this is Heron Gandy House, moving up along the street from Cuthbert House. And it's probably the heron that the house is named for is Patrick Heron. And Patrick Heron's name appears on early maps of this village, and the Heron family, specifically Patrick Heron, seems to have had a long association with this plot of land here in the village. He's listed as a carpenter in an early business directory of the village. Later on, the house would become the home of James Dandy, who was born in 1868. And James was the son of Thomas Dandy, who was a house painter. And there's an interesting story about Thomas Dandy. This is the first of my interesting people stories. Thomas Dandy was a house painter, and he was known to be a very staunch Anglican upbringing when he arrived in Canada. And one of the things he liked about Canada, one of the things he told the people that he liked about Canada, was that it was an open society where everybody was free to embrace their own religions. Yet being Anglican, Thomas Dandy was notorious for signing his name on every wall that he painted in people's house, and he would sign Thomas Dandy, and he would sign the date, and then the cryptic words, "No Pope." So one really has to question whether or not Thomas Dandy was really the admirer of Canada's religious freedom or not. That's my first of two interesting Thomas Dandy stories. The other is the somewhat sadder story that Thomas Dandy is a victim of an unsolved murder in Streetsville in 1879. Thomas Dandy was returning from being paid for one of his house painting jobs. And he seems to have been mugged or whatever on his way back through the forest on his way home. And he was found quite dead and quite without the money that he'd been paid for his job. And to my knowledge, no one was ever arrested or punished for this crime. So that's my interesting Thomas Dandy story. Although you should bear in mind that the Heron Dandy, the dandy that the house is named after, is James Dandy, which was the son of Thomas. Although I just couldn't resist talking about my interesting Thomas Dandy stories. This son, James Dandy, ran a hardware business in the village and served on town council for over 25 years, which is a fairly long time to serve on town council. He was very active in the development of a municipal power plant on the Credit River, which ended up being located near the intersection of Church and Ontario Streets, for those of you that are familiar with Streetsville. The house is worthy of note. It's 1.5-story height, typical of Ontario Regency style. It also has the hipped roof there, which you can get a pretty good look at, which again is very typical of the Ontario Regency style. The extension on the east side of the building, which I can't really see, was added in 1954. And this portico covering the front door is also a later addition. But other than that, the house remains fairly historically accurate. So it's a very interesting home. It really, really stands out when you're walking around. Okay, this is Tyrone Gross, as you can see. In 1837, John Embleton, who was a local land merchant in the area, sold this land to Andrew Freeborn, who was a grocer. And he had his store here from about 1837 until 1839. Then the property was sold to John Wilson, who probably rented and later sold the property to John Elliott Sterling and Robert Ramsey, who operated Tyrone House, which was a popular area hotel at the time, and probably named for County Tyrone in Ireland, but I'm not entirely sure about that. And there was a hotel operated on the site for a number of years. It was operated for a time under the name of the Exchange Hotel. It ceased being an inn around 1865, and it was later remodeled into the 2-story structure that you see today. And it is still used for commercial reasons, although obviously not as a hotel. And I always thought it was amazing. It's a very, very small, compact building. It's hard to imagine that it used to be 1-story, and yet it used to be an inn. It could have been a very large inn, but it had a fairly prominent spot, I believe, in Streetsville culture. A lot of the early newspapers make reference to horse races and a lot of things that were going on outside of Tyrone House. So it was probably a very popular meeting place for people in the village. This is this wonderful remote control device. This is the Cenotaph, which is at the corner of Queen and Main Streets in Streetsville. I'm sure anybody who's driven through town can't help but have noticed this structure. In 1925, shortly after World War I, a bunch of veterans organized the Streetsville Overseas Veterans Club under the leadership of Reverend Captain Frank Vipond in Streetsville. He was a wartime chaplain in a number of battalions throughout the war. And they decided to plan to construct a memorial to soldiers that hadn't returned from the war. They hired Samuel Finley from the Riverdale Technical School in Toronto as their architect. And the materials which they used in the construction of the Cenotaph were Credit Valley stone and locally made red brick from the Milton Pressed Brick Company. The site at Queen and Main Street was actually the site of an old band shell in Streetsville, which is maybe a little less known fact. It was the site of concerts and fairs and summer get-togethers, so it seems kind of appropriate that it remains a focal point within the village. The cenotaph was unveiled on Dominion Day, July 1st, 1926, by a Major General Lassard. The actual cenotaph stands 18 feet high and has bronze fixtures. The design for the cenotaph, they say, was taken from a local merchant, Fred Maas, who had erected in his store window a Lest We Forget display, in which he used a dark-colored brick to create this little memorial in his store window. And enough people were touched by the display when they walked by that it actually became kind of like a model for their real cenotaph. It is being rededicated and serves as a memorial for conflicts and wars subsequent to World War I. It was rededicated and restored in 1994, July 1st. It was unveiled, actually. I have another slide of the rededication ceremony going on here. And at the intersection of two busy streets, it really is a community focal point. And then I think it's kind of strikingly unique as a cenotaph. I've seen a few cenotaphs in some of the small villages I've driven through, and a lot of them were made simply of stone or concrete. So it's neat to see brick cenotaph. I think it really does epitomize the history of Streetsville, which, as a lot of you know, has had a long history of brick making in the village. So that's the cenotaph. This is an archival view taken from an old map of the County of Peel of John McMaster's store, which is our next stop along our armchair tour tonight. This brick building was built on the site of Israel Ransom's wood frame store, which was one of the first commercial enterprises in the village in the very early 1820s, very shortly after, well, maybe even before Streets Mills were even completed. By 1829, the village was enjoying bi-weekly postal service, and the first post office was located in Israel Ransom's store on this location. Ransom also ran a potashery on land that he bought from Timothy Street. And the area actually exported a lot of potash. It was a result of numerous local settlers who, when they took land in the area, also agreed to clear a certain percentage of it. And the hardwood trees that they would fell, clearing this land, would be burnt, and one of the products of the ash was this potash, which was used, I guess, in soap making and stuff overseas. Israel Ransom died in 1848, and McMaster would have taken up the store shortly afterwards. McMaster also served as the postmaster, I was saying, taking up where Israel Ransom had left off. The post office actually moved for a brief time across the street to another location, and then back to McMaster's store. And you can see above the door here that he's advertising that he's the post office as well. He did business in groceries and dry goods, and somewhere in my pile of stuff I have some photocopies of some old newspaper ads over there. And it's interesting to see the prices of some of his groceries in his store way back then. The store eventually came under the ownership of the Goodarum Works Company, which is famous mercantilers and mill operators in the southern Ontario region. And it was during Goodarum's ownership in 1876 that a fire destroyed the Telegraph and Globe hotels, which neighbored this store to the north, I believe, on Queen Street. And it was this fire that claimed the life of Timothy Street Jr. that I think I mentioned earlier. But this brick store survived and still stands today. And I'll show you a picture of what it looks like today. So it's a little changed, as you can see. It has a little more of a modern commercial look about it. I think there's actually very little that remains to indicate the building's true age, but the fact that it has survived is testimony to its worth to the heritage of the village. Kind of across the street here is where we're walking now. Well, actually, across the street to get a better view of this building. And this is John Embleton's store here, this kind of gray stucco building here at the front. The Embletons were one of the first families in Streetsville. John Embleton Sr. served as an innkeeper, a merchant, a township clerk, and a land agent. He's a very, very busy man. He was also a good friend of Timothy Street, and we know this because it is said in John Embleton's obituary that he helped build Street's mills. He's also listed as the executor of Street's will, so I take it to be two indications of his friendship with Street. John Embleton Sr. was also appointed surveyor of highways in 1830. He was very active in the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church community. His son, John Jr., was also a prominent citizen in Streetsville. He was elected reeve in 1864. He was a high school trustee in 1875. He was a shareholder in the Streetsville Port Credit Junction Railway Company, which was a tremendous money loser. He lost a lot of money becoming involved in that. I think I have another page. Yes, this is an archival view of the same structure when it was under the ownership of T.H. Goodison, and he ran his Popular House store here for over half a century. Also, on either a shelf in the back of the store or perhaps upstairs, the books of the Farmers and Mechanics Institute were kept for a number of years. The Farmer and Mechanics Institute we'll be talking about a little later on in the presentation. They're kind of a precursor to the Streetsville Public Library. I'll give you a little more information about that a little later on. T.H. Goodison served as a village reeve in 1912 to 1913. And the post office was here too. This is a post office that kind of made its way into almost every heritage structure in the township. I'm exaggerating, but it did move around a lot. Post office was here from 1931 to 1952. The building is now stuccoed, which you saw in the previous slide and the modern slide. And you can't really see here because this porch kind of overhangs, but above each of the windows and the front door, there were very graceful fan lights, which are no longer there, which is a shame because they were one of the nicer stylistic elements of the building. And of course, as you saw in the previous modern view of the building, it is still used commercially and is still charming, even though its appearance is not necessarily indicative of the building's true age. So you can see I'm doing a good job. I'm getting some of those architectural terms in there. Not many. Okay, this is Robinson Bravehouse, and this is my favorite house on our tour. It is a very, very interesting vernacular style, and it's multiple gables, which you really get the full effect when you're standing on the street and you can kind of walk around the building. It's very stunning. It's a striking addition to the streetscape along, this is Main Street, Queen Street, Streetsville, for those of you that are familiar with the area. And this area tends to be kind of the traditional storefront after storefront. And then all of a sudden along the street is this grandiose residence you just kind of come across, and it's really, really striking. I find it's one of the most striking buildings in the village. And it is now divided into separate establishments for commercial use. Again, you don't necessarily get the idea, but you can see kind of here there's a signpost indicates there are a number of stores and a little coffee house and whatever located there now. The house was actually built for a T.W. Robinson, who is listed as a 36-year-old butcher in the 1818 census, and I always thought this seemed like quite a residence for a butcher. I wonder how many butchers today are living in houses like this. The business directory in a local newspaper had this to say about Mr. Robinson. He is never behind when questions of interest to the town are to be considered. He is a competent judge of stock, and the public find at his market the choicest and best meats and fair, upright dealing. He also runs a successful livery business. These are certainly more than kind words, and they must be taken with a grain of salt because it is quite possible Robinson was paying somebody to have his name listed in this business directory, so he perhaps got to have a say in what was said about him. But even that little dose of historic cynicism can be balanced with the knowledge that he must have been reasonably popular in the village because he was elected Reeve in 1897. Now I thought this is kind of a Reeve-looking house, if not a butcher-looking house. So I could imagine kind of a Reeve living here. And the porch that is now featured here on the Queen Street side of the building is the result of a restoration project completed in 1989. And I think I have the historic view of the same building. So you get a better idea there. It's a much more residential looking area in this view, but you can see they've looked at this archival view and tried to match. I'll show you the other one again. You get an idea. All right, well, we're going to move along to the Graydon block, which is this commercial block here in the photo. When I was given this project in the summer, the idea was to revise an older walking tour pamphlet, which had a lot of things going for it. But one of the things we discussed was that this older tour was actually too long. So it didn't really make much sense to start adding buildings to a tour that was already too long. But this is one of the additions that we made, and I'm really pleased that we decided to make it because I think the Graydon block, as it's known, is a really interesting part of the commercial history of the village. It was built in 1891 by John Graydon for his nephew, William John Graydon. The Graydon family were active participants in Streetsville's commercial history. John's brother, Robert Graydon, owned another commercial block, which was on the other side of Queen Street, north of Pearl Street, which burnt down in 1909, I guess, somewhere around there, wiping out not only the stores, but Robert Graydon's house as well. And it is said, and so I'm kind of going on my memory on this was something I think I remember reading, it was said that when Robert Graydon's house burned down, his wife, who survived the fire unharmed, was so heartbroken and devastated by the loss of her home that she died of a broken heart 9 days later. Interesting story. Anyways, this Graydon block in this picture served as the second home of Robert Grieg's hardware store after he dissolved a business relationship with James Dandy, who we talked about earlier. James Dandy was running, or eventually would run, a rival hardware store right across the street in the Simpson block. And of course, I don't have any proof of there being a feud between Grieg and Dandy, but I always kind of imagined that rival hardware stores right across the street in a modestly sized village would be a bit of a slap in the face to somebody, but that's just my overactive imagination, I'm quite sure, going right there. And the present owner of the building is an Eric Ladner, who completed renovations on the structure to maintain its charm and appearance. And it is now the home of Allison's Restaurant, which is, I understand it's a very, very nice restaurant. If anybody's looking to dine in a heritage structure, they may want to go and check out Allison's. The red brick that you can see up here with the buff trim around each of those lights is very typical of a number of heritage buildings in the core of the village. And if you notice, a lot of the buildings we're going to look at and have already looked at, actually I'm not sure we've put that in yet, but a number of buildings we'll be seeing coming up are going to feature this red brick buff trim combination. It's very popular. This is an archival view of the Graydon block. So I think Eric Ladner has done a really excellent job maintaining the charm of this building. So, okay, this is Franklin House. And this building has a tremendous history, I think. It has a very tavern-like appearance when you look at it. You can just kind of imagine the sounds of a honky-tonk piano coming out of the front door of this one in the summer months. And this archival view, I think, really kind of epitomizes the kind of tavern-like appearance. But it was actually a private residence when it was built. It was built for Peter Douglas originally, and he died in 1855, shortly after the building was built. And his widow sold it to Bennett Franklin, after whom Franklin House is named, and it still bears that name. Bennett Franklin is a lumber dealer. He's listed as such in census reports around 1870. He was also a partner in the Barber woolen mills, which were located just south of the village, and we'll be talking about the Barbers later on. He actually married Sarah Barber, which was the sister of the mill owners, the Barber brothers. And Bennett Franklin probably ran a sawmill at the mill complex just south of the village. Franklin died eventually, as we all do, and the house was acquired by John Lennon. I have another picture, I think that was him as a proprietor. John Lennon was the previous owner of the Telegraph Hotel, which, if you remember, burnt down in 1876. Lennon, when he bought the Franklin House, maintained the name Franklin House, and he was the first in a long line of people to operate a hotel here. In the early 1900s, it was renamed the Queen's Hotel, and it was closed in 1914 when the Canada Temperance Act came into force, and the proprietors of the hotel could no longer get a liquor license. So I'm sure it was a bit of a triumph for the Temperance Society members in Streetsville. It was later converted into private apartments. Same house. And it fell into quite a state of disrepair, as you can see. It was unoccupied in this picture, and you can see it's being painted this elephant gray outside. And it barely escaped the Wreckers' Ball in 1979. My understanding is that the Wreckers' Ball was actually parked outside as people were petitioning the town council to have it stopped. I have another photo here. This is an archival view from a historic atlas, and you kind of get the idea of what it would have looked like in its heydays. And you can see that this is during the ownership of John Lennon, and he would have been responsible for adding these sheds and such over here. And I have a final modern view. This is what it looks like today. This is how it looked when I first saw it. So it really is a triumph for heritage workers who managed to recognize what was underneath that horrible elephant gray paint job and to restore the building somewhat to its original appearance. You can see that there's kind of a very dominant porch overhanging in the front of the house there, and it's now the home of a popular restaurant. And I also have an interesting story about the Franklin House that I'm going to share with you quickly before we move on. Franklin House is Streetsville's token haunted house. In 1987, the Mississauga News ran a story after a number of restaurant employees were complaining about a haunting. It is said that the ghost is a young girl that goes by the name of Jessie, who hanged herself in the rafters of Franklin House in 1888. She's said to be somewhat of a playful ghost, a bit of a prankster perhaps. The most exciting she gets is knocking salt shakers off of kitchen shelves and pulling foil off of its roll in its boxes in the kitchen. And sometimes people claim to be able to hear her walking around upstairs when everybody knows that the upstairs is empty. So the next time somebody dines in Franklin House, you can kind of have a look around and see if you can see Jessie. This is a modern view of the Oddfellows Hall. It was built in 1875 by the Independent Order of Oddfellows, which was a very typical secret fraternal society, featuring an exclusive white male membership. And their mandate was to aid the sick and distressed, but that's basically all I could find out about the Oddfellows. it seems to me that they really do take this secret stuff pretty seriously. No one seemed to really want to tell me what went on inside the Oddfellows Hall, but I spoke to my father, who's had some experience with secret societies, and I have a pretty good idea of what went on. The Masonic Lodge, which of course was another popular fraternal society, also met here. The Masonic Lodge was founded in Streetsville in 1876 by the Barber brothers, who were those mill owners of the town. The Oddfellows sold the hall in 1972, and renovations have much altered its original appearance. So I'll show you an archival view of the same building. You can see that this massive cornice up here at the top of the building is now gone, and the gabled architrave over the front doors and the first story windows is also gone. The hall would have been used as a social center for concerts and dances and banquets. The room upstairs also held the books of the Farmers and Mechanics Institute for a number of years before they would move into a public library of their own. And I would say that the heyday of secret societies in Streetsville seems to have passed. But I'm sure that people, perhaps a little bit older than I, in the audience will have a better picture of the role that these lodges and halls played in the village community. So maybe somebody could fill me in a little more at the end. Maybe not. Seems to be a secret. This is St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. It's one of the oldest congregations, organized congregations in Streetsville. There was a frame church on the site built in 1824. And this was land that would have been owned and then donated by Timothy Street. The Presbyterian Church was, of course, known as the Church of Scotland and listed as such in a lot of the early census reports. The Glendenning family, which were largely considered to be the first residents in the area, were staunch Presbyterians, and they may have had a little log church on their property as early as 1821 for the meeting of this congregation. But there was no permanent minister until Reverend Bell came to Streetsville in 1828. The congregation of St. Andrew's has had kind of a long and interesting history. In 1843, there was the Scottish disruption, which led to the Free Church movement in Canada. In 1925, there was a vote to remain a separate congregation, and they lost over half their membership to the United Church across the street and up a little bit. This brick building, seen in this slide here, replaced the old wooden structure in 1867. The red bricks are said to come from a brickyard located in Barbertown, which is the Barber Mill complex just south of Streetsville. The wooden spire up here at the top, octagonal wooden spire, is kind of a Streetsville landmark. It's a very prominent landmark on any views you see of a streetscape of Streetsville. The Glendennings, incidentally, who were the first residents of the area, left St. Andrew's when an organ was introduced into the church. They believed it to be the instrument of the devil. And the Glendenning family never returned to the congregation that they helped to found. Right next door to St. Andrew's is an area of Streetsville that's referred to as the Old Scotch Burying Ground. It's land, again, donated by Timothy Street, and there are deeds registered for this piece of land, where he gave the land to the church trustees in 1824 for the express purpose of providing a burial ground for all Protestant denominations. The first burial is said to be a young Scot that went by the name of Logan Mclaughlin. And this is another one of my interesting Streetsville people stories. Logan Mclaughlin came to Canada, and I may be embellishing here, but just go with me. He came to Canada as a young man with the idea to build a homestead so that he could bring his fiancée from his home country. And one day there was a terrible log jam on the Credit River, and the men of the village were kind of standing on the bank of the river, wondering what to do about this log jam. And young Logan Mclaughlin stuck up his hand and volunteered to be the one to climb out onto the log jam and to find that key log and pull it loose so that the logs would wash downstream. And you can imagine what's coming next. He, of course, went out onto the log jam, pulled out the log, only to have the entire log jam come free underneath his feet, and he was washed downstream. He was found about a kilometer downstream from the jam, quite dead, unfortunately. But gripped in his hand was a pine tree seedling that he had obviously tried to grasp to pull himself out of the river. And as a grave marker, he was the first burial in the Scotch burial ground. They planted this seedling at the head of his grave, and it was to serve as his grave marker. And my understanding is that this pine tree grew to be quite the size, although it was struck by lightning and is no longer alive today to mark where his grave is. The provincial plaque is for the village is located here. It was erected in 1975. The graves of a number of early settlers are found here, including the grave of Timothy Street. And there's a lot of the stones, which were very fragile, have been preserved in stone walls now. And the last burials in the cemetery took place in about 1890, when the cemetery was pretty full. And the cemetery company of Streetsville had to look elsewhere, and they eventually rested on a site on the other side of the Credit River. But it remains today to be quite an interesting site. This stone archway here features stonework that came out of a historic building that unfortunately had to be demolished. It was the home of Solomon Bamford, who we'll be talking about later. So the archway in itself is of historic interest for that reason. This is Timothy Street's grave, which is pretty centrally located. If you walk through that arch into the cemetery, you walk straight forward, you really can't miss it. So a number of the early settlers are buried here. And presumably Abigail Street is buried here as well, Timothy's wife, but there is no marker. This is Streetsville Memorial Park, which again is another new addition to this version of our walking tour. It wasn't on the old one. It was the site of agricultural fairs in Streetsville since 1843. And in fact, the Toronto Township held its agricultural fair here for about 100 years. We have a slide coming up. I'm sure a lot of you have been to Memorial Park for the Bread and Honey Festival in Streetsville. It's kind of set on a hillside, which forms a natural amphitheater where people could sit and watch plowing matches and races and livestock shows. In 1973, when there was a concern about the loss of identity that might arise when Streetsville joined the City of Mississauga, the Memorial Park became home to the Bread and Honey Festival, which inspired the graphic that's on the front of the pamphlet, the bread and honey there. And it attracts thousands of visitors every year, and it is a tribute to the milling and beekeeping history of the village. It is influenced by men like William Couse, who came to the town in 1880 and he was made famous for his honey, which was known in many counties. And he also ran a seed and grain business that catered to a worldwide market. And of course, in the background, way up here, you can see one of the flour mills in Streetsville, which is, of course, where the bread end of the Bread and Honey Festival came from. And it is of interesting note that beekeeper William Couse had a son who went on to serve as director of the Royal Agricultural Winter Fair, so there's quite a long fair history here. So we have an archival view of, I'm sure, one of the Toronto Township agricultural fairs, so you get an idea of what Memorial Park used to look like. This is the old grammar school, which is built on land which was donated by Timothy Street Jr. and his wife Margaret in 1850. In the pamphlet, I know that the grammar school is described by myself as a predecessor of the modern-day high school. However, I've done some research this past year on education in Ontario, and I no longer think that is an entirely accurate description of the role that the grammar school fulfilled in early education in Ontario, but we don't really have to go into that. The grammar school was the first of its kind in Peel County. It was built in 1851 with a capacity of 80 to 100 students. And you can just, right here at the back, is the portion of the building that was actually built in 1851. This front section was a later addition. In that first year, although with a capacity of 100 students, there were only about 15 or 20 registered. This front addition was added in 1877, by the way. The subjects that were taught in grammar schools included Latin, Greek, French, English, math, geography, history, and physical science. Kind of an interesting list of courses. Enrollment would decrease over the years as other more modern high schools opened in the county. And eventually, only grade 9 was being offered here in the 1950s, and eventually ceasing to be a school in the 1950s. Since that time, it has served as a town hall, police station, and is now the Kinsman and Senior Center in Streetsville. It also houses the archives of the Streetsville Historical Society. So that's, again, of interest. We're moving to the other side of Queen Street now and working our way north. This is the Bamford Bohemian house. Christopher Bamford, after whom the house is named, was an Irish Anglican carpenter and joiner. And an 1870s voters list has Christopher listed as a tenant in the Queen and Elgin Street area. So there seems to have been a long history of Bamfords on not only this property, but some of the surrounding properties as well. Christopher built this house sometime around 1875. And his children, William, John, and Charles Bamford, all participated in the carpentry and building trade. The Bamford brothers are said to have built the Robinson Bravehouse, the tower addition to Trinity Anglican Church, which we'll see later on. William Bamford married Mary Street, who was the daughter of Timothy Street Jr., so you can really get the feeling, that kind of the small town atmosphere about Streetsville there. All the Bamford brothers were also members of an early brass band, which was organized in the village in 1864. It was kind of short-lived. It was only around for about 10 years before it dissolved itself. The Bamford Bohemian house is an example of high Victorian eclecticism, with beautiful carved woodwork, which you can kind of see under there. Nice gables around. The wood siding, too. Again, I'm not sure how evident it is from this view. I have another view. Yeah, maybe a little more evident here. This wood siding has been notched to look like stonework, which is kind of an interesting stylistic feature of this house. So this is it under renovations. You can see that they've really done a lot in this house. This is an archival view of the building that we've called the Cunningham Tinsmith Shop in the new Walking Tour pamphlet. In 1854, the Farmers and Mechanics Institute was organized in the village. And one of their goals was to establish a circulating library and reading room to benefit members of the village. The first books, as I said earlier, were housed in John Appleton's store. And in 1859, there were said to be 400 volumes in the collection. By 1877, they had no doubt outgrown their space in the store, and their 1,400 volumes moved to the newly built Oddfellows Hall, which we again saw earlier. And it was open for a few evenings a week, and its members could come in and peruse the library. The last meeting of the Farmers and Mechanics Institute was held in 1895, and the books in the Institute were reorganized to become the Streetsville Public Library. Matthew and William Cunningham operated their tinsmith business in this board and batten structure throughout the second half of the 19th century. In 1902, the Cunninghams allowed the Public Library Board to acquire this property, and the books of the public library, you can see that here it's already the library, so this is a post-1902 picture. The books of the library stayed here for 65 years until a new library at 112 Queen Street was built as a centennial project. And incidentally, in 1902, when the books were moved here, it became officially a free library, so you no longer had to be a member to peruse the collection. So this is a modern view of the building, how it looks today. You can see they've redone the sign up here. It's the Streetsville Village Hall. And actually, at other ends of the sign, it bears tribute to its history as both a tinsmith shop and as the public library.
What's it used for doing this?
I'm not sure what the building is used for now. It's just a meeting room.
The bowling organization meets there, and so does the Historical Society.
There you go. This is the bowling green. The Cunningham family also donated the land just south of the library, this land here, to be used by the Lawn Bowling Club, which started bowling here about 1907. The land was supposed to be known as Cunningham's Green to pay tribute to the family that donated the land, but the name really never seemed to catch on. Most people in the village just know it as the Bowling Green or the Lawn Bowling Club. And it's interesting, I don't know whether you really get the sense from this photo, but the green is actually below street level, so that anybody walking along the sidewalk has a great view of the games as they're in progress. This is a photo of Streetsville United Church, and the congregation also has a very interesting history in Streetsville. It has its roots in Methodism. There are 3 branches of Methodism, all of which have a following in Streetsville: Wesleyan, Primitive, and Episcopalian Methodists. And there is evidence of Methodist meetings in the area since early 1820s. There were Methodist chapels at the corner of Alpha Mills Road and Mississauga Road. Also a brick building which opened in 1848 at the corner of Maiden Lane and Church Streets. This brick building replaced an earlier wooden frame church that was still at the same location. But in around 1870, the Methodists had outgrown this Maiden Lane chapel, and they sold it first to the Grangers, an agricultural organization, and it would later become a public school. And they built their new church, which is this church here. And a cornerstone for this church was laid in 1875 by Egerton Ryerson, who was superintendent of schools and founder of the modern school system in Ontario. Thus, the church was opened the following year, 1876. In 1881, there was a uniting of the 3 branches of Methodism. And in 1925, half of the Presbyterian congregation came across the street and up a little bit to join the Methodists and become the modern-day United Church of Canada. There's an addition you can see here at the back, which I'm noting because it was actually added in 1950, and I understand that that's a bit of an error. The pamphlet lists an addition in 1953, and simply not possible. There were no additions in 1953. The next entry on the tour is actually a combination of 2 houses that belonged to the Cunningham brothers, who ran the tinsmith shop that you just saw a few moments ago. They were Scottish immigrants who bought this land in 1859. The first house, which is this one here, is located at number 11 Berry Street. It's a designated heritage structure, as are a number of the buildings we've seen. They're all indicated in the pamphlet. It's Ontario Regency in style. The second house, on the slide here, yeah, which is this house here, is at 19 Berry Street, which belonged to the other Cunningham brother. There's a mixture of Ontario Regency style and Greek revival. And I always thought it was kind of a shame they have these bushes growing here at the front, and it kind of hides a bit of the stylistic attractiveness of the building. But you really do get a sense they go together nicely. They both feature that red brick buff trim that we talked about. These are, again, the Cunninghams that donated that land to the public library and the Lawn Bowling Club. Of note, actually, before I leave this slide, the old walking tour featured a house listed as the Old Parsonage, just the Old Parsonage of the United Church, which used to stand at number 20 Berry Street. And it was demolished, supposedly to make room for more parking. But those of you that are familiar with the Streetsville area know that they haven't done anything with the land since it was demolished. So it used to be right across the street behind the United Church, but it's no longer there. Also of note, before I flip over to the next slide, if we were actually standing kind of down here in the Thomas Street, Berry Street area, and we're looking west across the CPR tracks, was the approximate location of the Glendenning Homestead. And if you'll remember, the Glendennings were, as I described, the first residents in the area. They came to the area around 1818, had a land along Mullet Creek there. Their homestead was known as Terrace Park, and they're said to have kept a herd of deer in a fenced enclosure. Seems like an odd historical fact, but I did come across it somewhere. They also had a small mill that was running off the water power from Mullet Creek. This is also approximately the site where local builder John Graydon had a saw and grist mill. There's a long history of woodworking on the property. Dominion Sash was located on the site of Graydon's sawmill. McFerrin Brick, Canada Brick, made brick here until the 1990s. Predecessors of those brickyards included Streetsville Brick in 1911 and Graydon's Brickyard before that. Moving along to the buildings that are on the tour. This is a good picture. It's a good picture. Fulton House. Sarah Graydon, who was known affectionately as Sally, was just a baby when the Graydons came from County Fermanagh in Ireland to Canada, and she would become the second wife of Joseph Fulton in 1873. This house was built by Sarah's brother, John Graydon, and Sarah and Joseph Fulton moved into the house around 1888. Joseph Fulton was employed at Barber's Mills, located just south of the village, and the house is now used for commercial purposes, as you can kind of get the sense from this photo. And one of its most impressive stylistic elements is the carved birch board, which you really get a good view of here in this photograph. It's a nice close-up view. Thomas Patterson House. Thomas Street, on which this house is located, is named after Thomas Patterson. Thomas Patterson was the son of James Patterson, who was known as the Laird of Bonnie Brae. Bonnie Brae is the name of the Patterson Homestead, which was located where the Vista Heights subdivision is. And those of you who are familiar with Streetsville will know where I'm talking about. Pattersons settled in the area around 1820s, and their graves are in the burying ground, along with some of the earlier settlers. Son Thomas Patterson, after whom the house bears the name, was a merchant. He also sat on the first town council in 1858 under Reeve John Street. Thomas's wife Agnes was said to have run a ladies' school in the village. You don't get a sense from this picture, but there's a kitchen wing to this house that was added in 1870. Otherwise, the building is unaltered from its original 1847 form. It is colonial Regency in style and is now the home of Mary and Hugh Manning. Mary has authored a number of the sources that I used and throughout my research. She was also kind enough to grant me an interview and was a tremendous help solving a number of the little mysteries that I had come across over the summer. So you can tell from this picture there's an iron fence that's been added to the front now, but the house is very well maintained. When I visited it this summer, there were beautiful gardens. It's well worth walking by in the summer, if only to look at the gardens. And it's a testimony to people who care a great deal about Streetsville's heritage. This is an archival view of the Simpson block, which was built around 1865, Thomas Simpson petitioned to sell liquor in his store, known as the Mammoth House, but he never got a license. In 1894, it was owned by James Dandy, who was the house painter, town councilman, ran a rival hardware business. You remember this story from earlier. Dandy rented his store to his brother-in-law, fellow councilman Robert Greig. Greig wouldn't pay when Dandy increased the rent. And this is when Greig moved across the street and opened his own hardware business in another building. The small brick building next door, which I presume is this one, is said to have been a post office for a short time after the 1909 fire destroyed Robert Graydon's post office north of here. I have a modern view of this building, so do the comparison. This here. Replacement windows here at the front have really altered the fenestration on the lower front facade of this building. How's that for architectural terminology? James Dandy, in addition to his work in hardware, had worked for a spell at Barber's Mills, that you've heard a lot about so far, and he lost his hand there in an industrial accident. Just another one of my interesting stories. This is a picture of Streetsville's oldest building, undergoing some renovations here, as you can tell. And this building is known as Montreal House, and you can see here on the original clapboarding the words Montreal House that were painted on the side. This is the first time I think we're going to be mentioning the Barnhart family, which are certainly worthy of mention in Streetsville's history. This store was owned by John Barnhart, who operated a trading post and general store, and he did quite a good business serving settlers and native Canadians in the area. He purchased land from first settler John Graydon. It also stood at a busy intersection between Queen Street running through the village and the main street that ran down towards Street's Mill. So everybody who came into the village who were in need of trading post goods would probably have stopped at Montreal House. In 1843, Jabez was the son of John Barnhart, started a newspaper in the upstairs of Montreal House. And other brother Solomon J. Barnhart would continue Jabez's work, starting at the Streetsville Review in 1876. This is one of the longest running, earliest community newspapers across Ontario. It is still available on microfilms at the Peel Archives, and anybody interested in Streetsville history, Streetsville social history, would get a big kick out of going and looking at some early editions of the review, and they have them right back to an edition in 1843. Very interesting source. The first editor of the Streetsville Review was a Reverend Robert McGeorge, who was the first Reverend of the Anglican Church. John Barnhart Jr. was a prominent local doctor, and he became the first county warden of Peel in 1865. Daughter Minerva Barnhart married William H. Patterson, who ran a store, and Patterson was said to be the first person to ship Upper Canada wheat from Ontario to Montreal for export. John Barnhart Sr. also developed the interesting tradition of giving homes to his children as they grew up and married and left. And these Queen Street residences had some colorful names: Solomon's Temple, Minerva's Bower, Noah's Ark, as some examples. I understand Minerva's Bower is the only one of the bunch that's still standing, and it is much renovated and is now, I believe, the home of the Winchester Arms, for those of you familiar with the Streetsville area. A much renovated. The Barnhart family also owned a grist mill on the Credit River, which would become the property of the Beatty family in 1830. And since 1902, this early grist mill has been operating under the name of Reed Mill, one of Canada's largest manufacturers of soft wheat flour. I have a modern view of this building. Here is how it looks today. And you can see that the clapboarding up here has really been restored to its original, well, nearly its original width. So it's fairly well maintained, and it's the two-story clapboards with a medium-pitched gable roof is very typical of early 19th century commercial structures. So it's a wonderful heritage treasure in Streetsville. This is the public utilities building, and I have a few slides of this one that will be of interest. This is a modern view. The building was actually built in 1876, but this isn't its original location. It was moved here in 1939, but was actually originally located at the corner of Maiden Lane and Church Streets. As I was telling you earlier when we were discussing the history of the United Church in Streetsville, the Wesleyan Methodists had a chapel there, which they outgrew and sold to the Grangers and later to the Public School Authority. The public school added this brick addition in the 1880s. And the school actually remained in operation until 1939, when the old chapel part had deteriorated and had to be demolished. This structure has served as a municipal building, a fire hall, a police station, and headquarters of the Public Utilities Commission until 1977. Now, the first time I saw this building, I thought that there was a curious asymmetry in the arrangement of the windows. They're not all on the same level, and the door seems to be in an odd location. And it wasn't until I had seen a historic view of this building that you get a better sense of what it would have looked like. You can see the older brick part over here that's no longer in existence, and of course the school children who would have been attending school in the building. Also on the property, on its new location, is this little metal water wheel, which was taken from the municipal power plant, which operated on the Credit River during the first half of the 20th century. And we're moving on, actually, to a slightly greater history of provision of power to Streetsville. The next site along our tour is a new addition to the tour, and I said earlier that the Robinson Bravehouse is my favorite building on the tour. But I think the Hyde Mill ruins is my favorite site on the tour, if no longer qualifying as a complete building. The old stone ruins, which from this archival view you don't really get a good view, you'll see it better in a moment. The old stone ruins in which would house the power equipment were once John Hyde's Ontario mills, which were built in 1850. In 1851, as census reports, production 18,000 barrels of flour in the year. It was a 6-story high structure. It's quite a big brick building. John Hyde was the son of Mary and Hammond Hyde, who were prominent local innkeepers and had a pretty famous inn just up the street from their son's mill. The mill was bought by James Goodarum of the Goodarum and Warts family, and Goodarum converted the mill into a linen mill. It unfortunately burnt down in 1867, the Confederation year, and was never rebuilt to serve as a mill. However, the village used the stone housing to build the concrete power dam in 1908, and you can see the dam here, damming the credit. It provided sufficient power on its own for a quarter of a century until the electric appliance boom in the 1930s. And it is said that in the summer, when water on the credit was running at a lower level, they would shut off the power during the day when people were at work and when there was sufficient sunlight to light the day work, so that they could store up the water for the evening hours when people wanted the power on. The local hydro authority joined forces with Ontario Hydro in 1934, and the municipal power plant remained in operation for a number of years after that. The generating equipment was removed in 1975, and the brick part of the housing is now used by a cadet organization. I'll show you a modern view of this. This is the stone housing part. You can see the brick part over here. The brick part is used by a cadet organization now, and you actually have to kind of walk down the hill to the banks of the Craddock to get a good view of what's remaining. And I was kind of thinking in my mind this afternoon that just being able to have the word ruins on a walking tour really brings Streetsville in line with Greece and Egypt in terms of historical interest. And I was glad to see it wasn't edited out of the final version of the walking tour, because I really like ruins. This is a view of Trinity Anglican Church. The members of the Anglican faith in the Streetsville community were without a place of worship until 1841, though the Presbyterians and the Methodists had buildings as early as the 1820s. The first rector of the Anglican Church was Reverend Robert Jackson McGeorge from Glasgow, who was also the first editor of the Streetsville Review. He wrote very entertaining editorials in the paper under the pseudonym of Solomon. The cornerstone for this building was laid in 1842 by Bishop Strong. The bricks were donated by Commodore Henry Rutledge, who was the original patent holder for most of the land that now forms the northern part of the Streetsville streetscape. The original style of the church is actually Greek Revival, but the Bamford brothers, whom we mentioned earlier, built the tower addition here and in 1876, and the windows were reworked with pointed arches at the top before the turn of the century to reflect the more popularized Gothic appearance of the building. So it's kind of an interesting stylistic change going on. The rear addition to the church, which you can't see in this view, was added in 1931, and the parish hall of the church in 1960s. The Anglican cemetery, located just to the north of the church, has many interesting grave sites of early residences and is worth walking in and having a tour if you're interested. Oh, here's a good view of the church there. You can see the additions in the parish hall down here that was added later. This is John Graydon House, and it is another new addition to the revised version of our Heritage Tour. John Graydon was the son of William and Margaret Graydon, who came from County Fermanagh in Ireland. John was a talented builder who was responsible for a number of the buildings that we've seen so far, the Graydon Block, Fulton House. Also had his hand in the building of the Loyal Orange Hall, which we'll see, and this residence at 62 Queen Street. John Graydon also owned a brickyard, a sawmill on Mullet Creek. He was reeve of the village several times in the last 25 years of the 19th century. He served as the warden of Peel in 1897. The Graydons were traditionally Anglican. Here's another people story. Though it is said that John Graydon and his wife Jane converted to Methodism when they lost a child before it had been baptized, and the Anglican Church refused to allow the child to be buried on consecrated ground. This house struck me, actually. Before I knew anything about the house, I was up in Streetsville walking around and I saw it across the street, and I thought, wow, that has got to be a heritage structure. That's got to go on my tour. And it really is an impressive addition to the streetscape. Yet it turns out when you see an archival view of the building, it's quite different. It's actually quite surprising, and it's very altered from its original appearance. So you can see this marvelous porch here in the upper story there, all gone now. The carved woodwork up there. So there's actually very little remaining of this house to indicate what it looked like historically, but it's still an awesome representative of the era. So made it into the new version of the tour. Here's a picture of the Loyal Orange Lodge, and I described Streetsville in the tour as a hotbed of orangism. Which I think is an accurate description. It's not actually my description. Accurate because there were two orange lodges in Streetsville by 1840. One run by the Graydon family. This was lodge number 263. the other by Henry Rutledge. This was lodge number 290. The lodge pictured here, the lodge house, was built by William and John Graydon in 1855 on land donated by Henry Rutledge, who ran the other lodge. So that was kind of interesting. The Orange Order, for those of you who are maybe not familiar, is a staunchly Protestant organization with strong Irish roots. One of their mandated causes was the strong resistance of separation of Canada from Britain. They didn't want that to happen at all. The two lodges in Streetsville, incidentally, came together in 1916. And those of you who grew up in small towns can perhaps remember July 12th celebrations, which marked the anniversary of the Battle of the Boyne. And they were marked by parades and picnics and banquets and such, and were popular in a number of small towns throughout Canada, not just Streetsville. The building, as you can see here, has fallen into disuse, but it still has a very imposing appearance with its fairly heavy cornice up here. Again, it's located right on the sidewalk, and in order to get a view, you really have to stand on the other side of the street. And there's unfortunately this telephone booth, which I understand has been moved, or maybe not. And of course here you can see it's a single front door. It used to apparently have large double front doors, which would have been more impressive, but they were replaced in 1960. This charter, which is pictured on the front cover of the pamphlet, is the Credit Valley Railway Station. In the early 1850s, this is kind of predating the station a little bit. In the early 1950s, the Streetsville newspapers were filled with debate over various proposed routes for a railway through the township. Obviously, Streetsville residents believed that the route through Streetsville was the only level ground capable of supporting a railway. And they were stating this opinion free of any local bias, of course. Other routes proposed ran through Port Credit, and they were hotly criticized in Streetsville publications for running through far inferior land with marshes and sour, sterile soil. But unfortunately for the residents of Streetsville, the route bypassed the village, and as a result, Streetsville entered a bit of an economic recession from which it never would quite regain its glory. Although the Streetsville residents tried to show a bit of an indifferent attitude when they were slighted by the railway in this way, and they stated that in village ads that Streetsville prosperity did not require railway puff to dilute its enlightened public. They did get a railway eventually in 1879, and I have a picture. And this was a junction of the Credit Valley Railway. Although in 1879 it was perhaps a little bit too late for Streetsville to catch up with many other of the villages in the area that did get a railway connection earlier and had bounced ahead in terms of economic terms. The opening of the Credit Valley Railway was met with a tremendous celebration in Streetsville. Invitations went out to village railway advocates for a dinner and an inaugural train ride on Friday, April 19, 1879. James Goodarum, who was a former Methodist minister and a local mill owner, businessman, was one of the CVR's strongest advocates, and he was said to have given a rousing speech at the dinner, and got on the train with the other party goers when the train stopped suddenly, and James Goodarum got off to see what the problem was. Perhaps he had had too much celebrational drink that evening or whatever. He was fatally wounded when the train started up again. These aren't modern locomotives, they can't move that fast, but he was fatally wounded and he died within the week, so that celebration was marred by a tragedy. As you can see in this, well, perhaps as you can't see in this picture, the building is actually oriented different on its new location, where it was moved actually away from the railway tracks in 1914 on horse-drawn carts, if you can imagine. And it's now oriented with the turret facing south, when in fact, when it was located on the tracks, the turret faced north, And unlike many early train stations throughout southern Ontario, it wasn't painted railway red. It was more a romantic white color. And the turret would have housed the telegraph operator who had a clear view up and down the tracks. I have another wonderful picture that's of interest. This is a locomotive, and you can see down here, it bears the name of the Credit Valley Railway. So it's quite an interesting picture. This is the kind of train that would have been coming into the station on a regular basis. This is an archival view of St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church. In 1857, Richard Cuthbert, who, if you'll remember from, I think, our third building earlier on in our evening, is the shoemaker. Richard Cuthbert and his wife Elizabeth deeded land to the Roman Catholic Episcopal Company to build a Roman Catholic church. Previous to this time, any Roman Catholics interested in coming to Mass journeyed to Cuthbert's private residence, which is located across the street from the Roman Catholic Church, and they held Mass in Cuthbert's home. The opening ceremonies for this new building took place on July 18th of 1858, and 600 local residents came out to see Bishop de Chardonnel dedicate the chapel to St. Joseph and consecrate the land on which the church stands. Unfortunately for the building, perhaps, there was a fire in 1985, and the building, although still standing, and I have a modern view of it up here on the hill, still standing, though no longer used as a church. The land was actually deconsecrated in 1987, and it's now an art gallery, the Rivercrest Art Gallery. This is a slide of the Brown Mccarroty house. It was built in the 1860s. It was a farmhouse. Its original owners were the family of George Brown from Cumberland, England. Came to Canada in the 1820s. In 1885, a Hugh Mccarroty came into ownership. And he is said to be one of the first two farmers to import purebred Holstein cattle into Peel County. He would sell the property to his son, David Mccarroty, just before the turn of the century. And David introduced other breeds of cattle into his father's prize-winning herd to raise the butterfat levels in the milk for other uses. David was actually elected director of the Milk and Cream Producers Association in 1926. So as you can understand, and as you can see from the house, he was a fairly prosperous farmer. David also held the 46th wardenship of Peel, and he died in 1932 when his son took over. And the farm is known as Walnut Hill Farm, and cattle were raised here until 1958. This isn't necessarily the closest picture, but you still get a feel for the fine yellow brickwork that outlines the house, and you have a good view here of this interesting drive shed, which is one of the more distinguishing features of the structure. The drive shed was kind of the precursor to what we now have as garages. And this picture was taken at the dedication of this park, which it lies right before the house. They were renaming a road and decided to make sure that the family got some recognition for their long-standing history on the site. We're really getting close to winding up here, so just be patient. This is the Leslie Log House at its original location. It was the home of John Leslie, who came from Rogart, Scotland in 1824. He operated a 100-acre farm, actually quite north of Streetsville, no, not quite, north of Streetsville. And he built this log home probably in 1826. That's a date that's actually carved into one of the timbers in a bedroom of the house. So it's more than likely the year in which it was built. It's a typical log home, as you can see, and it was probably built from logs that the Leslie family cleared from their land when they arrived. The farm eventually went to stepson John Jr. in 1874, and then to Christopher Rutledge in 1884. Although John Leslie Sr. was allowed to live out his life in the log home until his death in 1894, which is over 70 years in this log home. It is unique in that it survived. It remained a private residence for so long, whereas most log homes, as farmers got more settled, would become sheds for livestock and storage of farm implements, and they were allowed to deteriorate. But it was because it remained a private residence that it survived to today, and at one time it even featured a clapboard exterior, so it was quite a modern looking little house. This is the Leslie Log House on the move. It was moved on May 24th of last year, 1994, to its new location on the Pinching Farm, which is located near the intersection of Mississauga and Eglinton Roads, just south of Streetsville now. So you can see the log home being moved here, and up here you can see the roof following along behind.
They had to take the roof off so to get under the overhead wires.
Right. So this is the log home at its new location on the farm. And actually the last time I'd seen the home, last summer, they had refurbished this stone foundation. So it managed, my understanding is that there was very little, if anything, broken during the move. It remained reasonably well intact. And the future of the log home is somewhat undetermined as of yet. There are some proposals on the table for possible uses as an interpretive center or as a meeting place for clubs and other interested organizations. But it'll be interesting to follow the history of the Leslie Log House as it develops in its new location. This is an archival drawing of the area of Streetsville known as Barbertown, or Barberton. This is the last location on our walking tour. It actually appears only as a point of interest in the pamphlet, so there's no information. Its approximate location was near the intersection of Barberton Roads, south of Streetsville at Mississauga Road. William Comfort actually owned the land in 1828, and he ran a grist mill here. He was known to be a sympathizer of William Lyon Mackenzie during the 1837 rebellion in Upper Canada. When Mackenzie was fleeing from the authorities, Comfort hid him in a barn and gave him dinner, and escorted him on his escape out of town towards Hamilton. Little did Comfort know, perhaps, that this would be his undoing. He was arrested for his involvement, and militiamen are said to have tormented his pregnant wife to such an extent, following Comfort's involvement, that she became gravely ill. When she and the baby died the day before Comfort was released from jail. In 1844, Comfort sold the land to William and Robert Barber, who immediately converted the mill to a woolen mill. The Barber family are said to have hailed from Antrim in Ireland, and they came to Canada in 1822. They also ran a mill in Georgetown. The Barbers were in business with Bennet Franklin, of Franklin House, which we saw earlier. And together they ran one of the most extensive manufactories in the province at the time, at its peak employing nearly 200 people, producing 900 yards of award-winning tweed every day. In 1861, there was a fire, but the mill was prosperous enough that unlike other mills that burnt down, it was rebuilt. A small village sprang up to support the mill, and it's this village that kind of became known as Barbertown, or Barberton. And on the site, there was a store, a sawmill, a brickyard, a boarding house, a blacksmith, a cricket field, and 43 double houses where the mill workers could live. It was Bennet Franklin that helped build these 43 mill workers' homes, and a couple of them still survive on the north side of Eglinton Avenue, just east of Mississauga Road. There's kind of a little dip in Eglinton where there's
Actually, south side. Oh, sorry, north side.
north side.
Yes, south side. I'm not turning around.
And these mill workers' houses are actually a tangible reminder of the manufacturing and social history of the village, although they're somewhat ignored because they lack maybe the aesthetic charm of some of the other heritage structures. The mill, or a mill, continued to work on the site through World War I under the name of the Oriental Textile Company. It was later converted to a flour mill and I have some other views. Here's another archival drawing of you can see the general store in that thing. This is somewhat what it looks like today. It was converted to a flour mill, which is still in operation. And some of the original buildings are still here. This building, although the roof is different, is an original building. Yeah, this is, again, one of the original buildings that still survives on the site. This is a restaurant I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, part of Barberton, the old Bravehouse restaurant. There were actually two residences of the Barber brothers, Robert and William. And Robert and William were said to get along so well that they never had a contract or agreement governing their business relationship. Robert's house was demolished a few years ago, but William's home, which is this house, at the corner of Barberton and Mississauga Road, is still standing. It remained a private residence until quite recently. I have another view of it when it was still a private residence. And it stands in contrast, if you will, to the modest mill workers' homes on Eglinton in its grandeur and size, so you can get a view of how the mill workers lived versus how the mill owners lived. And the house itself is a testimony to the prosperity of Barberton as a whole. We also have this final picture, which shows up here the home of Robert Barber, which was no longer there. It was on the other side of the road, and down here, an archival drawing of the old Barber house, which is still there. You always have to take these drawings with a bit of a grain of salt because there's the potential that these people paid to have their homes drawn and included in these historic atlases. So the grounds may not have been as well kept, and the houses themselves perhaps not as grand as they're depicted. And that's it. Let's see if I can get lights to come up here so I can actually. Okay, she's going to override my remote control. Maybe not. This is the sum of 3 months of research. Modern technology at its best.
Say the magic word.
Everybody clap their hands. Clap all. Clap all.
White flower.
That would be better if you clap on. Maybe you feel some pressure while I try to go outside.
Yeah, I just like to reiterate thank yous to Mr. and Mrs. Emerson, who are sitting there in the back, for their invaluable help putting together the slides. As a student, I don't actually live in Mississauga full time. I'm on my reading week right now, so you can imagine that I'm a bit of a distance away from the visual resources that were available. And Mr. and Mrs. Emerson spend, I'm sure, a lot of their free time over the past couple of weeks putting together these slides that we looked at tonight. Thanks also to the Streetsville Historical Society for making their archival views of these buildings available for use in tonight's presentation.
Sorry.
And also to the staff of Heritage Mississauga for organizing the evening and the whole project, really. They provided lots of guidance throughout and showed no end of patience as their office was taken over by a pair of rambunctious university students all last summer. I'd be happy to entertain any questions people might have at this time. I can't guarantee I'm going to have answers to everything, but I may be able to indicate where you could go to get answers. And certainly if people have comments or corrections, they'd be more than welcome. Sorry that I'm late.